When George Washington was installed as the first president of the United States in 1789, a time of testing began for the new nation, beset by enemies, disrupted by internal problems, plagued by financial crisis, and embroiled by the ongoing dispute between those who favored state government and those who supported the new federal government. The nation's future seemed uncertain. Washington realized that he, as the first president, must deal not only with these problems, but must do so in a way that would gain support for and confidence in the constitutional government. The need for balance, fairness, and integrity were Washington's guidelines as he took office. Following these demanding guidelines, he embarked on the perilous journey of transforming a theoretical government into a practical reality. After his inauguration at the temporary national capital of New York, Washington went about creating the substance of government. His goal was to create both a dignified presidency and an efficient method of administration. He soon created a cabinet of advisors, with each cabinet member heading one executive department. Washington quickly established a specialized bureaucracy to handle the many and diverse problems the presidency faced. He chose Alexander Hamilton, on the right, as his Treasury Secretary, and Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State. Although these two men were politically in conflict, Washington realized that if he could supervise them, the nation would profit from the talents of both men. Throughout Washington's presidency, his actions were marked by this careful, practical logic. He aimed to steer a middle course in government, and although those under him were not immune to factional strife, Washington was determined that the president would be aloof. Socially, he held to this notion of dignified aloofness. He insisted that the president be free of social obligation, and he conducted his ceremonial duties with reserve. He even established certain days as official reception days. From the start, Washington's government reflected responsibility, calmness, sobriety, and above all, a sense of fairness and stability. If it lacked in excitement, his presidency inspired confidence. Governmental action soon showed doubters that this confidence was well placed. The Bill of Rights was passed by Congress. 10 amendments guaranteeing personal liberties were added to the Constitution, thus fulfilling the promises made by the Federalists. North Carolina, now satisfied with the government's good faith, entered the Union as the 12th state in 1790. Washington also toured the country twice during his first term in order to show the public that, as president, he represented all the people. It was a wise political move, for the new government needed all the support it could get. The French Revolution had broken out in 1789, and Europe was thrown into upheaval. The effects of that revolution reached out like a tidal wave, threatening to engulf the U.S. The revolution in France dominated all thought. Hamilton favored the British, who were opposed to the revolution, while Jefferson supported the French. Washington, knowing America was too weak to be involved, advocated neutrality and sought to keep the U.S. out of the conflict. Vital domestic issues concerned Washington during his first term, and he kept a wary but neutral eye on Europe. He managed to restrain his 2 cabinet ministers while he went about reconstructing the nation's declining financial system. In this, he turned to Hamilton. Hamilton was a firm believer in a strong federal government controlled by an elite of the wealthy, and he was eager to construct an economic system that favored native industry and was regulated by the federal government. He espoused the creation of a government-sponsored Bank of the United States, which would regulate money, would pay off the debts incurred by the Revolution, and would feed federal monies into the economy. The bank was approved and set up, and was responsible for much of the success of Hamilton's programs. It would, however, be a source of controversy and opposition, especially by small farmers, until President Andrew Jackson revoked its charter nearly 40 years later. By imposing high import taxes on foreign imports, Hamilton stimulated native industry. This profited Hamilton's political allies among New York's and New England's merchant and industrial classes, but antagonized the agriculturalists of the South and the West, who needed foreign trade and markets. A tax on whiskey was another point in Hamilton's program, and was advocated primarily to show that the federal government had the power to tax its citizens. The tax, which affected small Western farmers, eventually became a focal point of crisis. Hamilton's support of the urban North soon led to the growth of party politics. Since Hamilton favored a strong federal government, he and his followers were known as Federalists. Generally, the Federalists favored Britain, distrusted the masses of common people, and were engaged in banking, commerce, and industry. Farmers and planters of the South, the West, and the rural North, led by Thomas Jefferson, were known as Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists favored a weak central government, states' rights, and alliance with Republican and revolutionary France. President Washington averted outright hostility between these two camps by playing the exacting role of temporizer and mediator. Although he generally aligned himself with Hamilton, at least in domestic affairs, he managed to achieve a more or less happy medium between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. A climate of success took root throughout the country and was made evident by Rhode Island's eventual entrance into the Union. In 1791, Vermont also achieved statehood. Despite troubles, the nation was growing and taking shape. However, by 1792, Washington was weary of the demands of the presidency. He began to think of Mount Vernon, his estate, and retirement as his first term drew to a close. Under his leadership, the Constitution had become a reality, and the United States was established on the road to success. The government was in good condition. The question now was, what would its eventual shape be? Not, would it survive? Willing to leave this question to be answered by others, Washington began to compose a farewell address. The lure of Mount Vernon, of peace and escape from the burdens of leadership, and of life at the new capital, Philadelphia, was irresistible. But even as he planned on retirement, events were transpiring to forestall his resolve. The bloody reign of terror broke out in France as the now radical French government began sending thousands of aristocrats and political enemies to the guillotine. It spawned a major international crisis. When the deposed king, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were sent to the guillotine, the situation became explosive. Nations throughout Europe prepared for war, especially anti-French Britain. America, too, became involved. Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary, emigrated to France, where his pamphlet, The Rights of Man, called for drastic radical action. He was joined by Joel Barlow, another radical American writer. At home, Americans took sides. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, called for alliance with Britain. Called Anglo-men, they were readily opposed by Jefferson's pro-French Gallo-men. Both sides clamored for war. Conspiracies and plots were hatching everywhere. Only Washington's calm and stern presence kept the matter from getting completely out of hand. Finally, James Madison urged Washington not to retire. If Washington was removed from the scene, the next president would most likely be Washington's vice president, John Adams. Adams, a devout and not very popular Federalist, would be so politically committed to one side that he would never be able to weather the gathering political storm. The consequences could be tragic for the country. Washington gave in to Madison's fervent requests and agreed to a second term, which he won easily in November of 1792. Disaster was momentarily sidestepped, but the pressures of government were taking a grave physical toll on Washington. Foreign affairs became the paramount issue of Washington's second term, just as domestic concerns keynoted his first term. Turning to foreign relations, Washington was confronted with gigantic and threatening problems. All Europe was at war, with Britain leading a coalition against France. The European world plunged into a conflagration which wouldn't end for a generation. As a maritime nation, the U.S. was caught up in the struggle, but Washington was determined, despite public war fever, to keep that involvement to a minimum and to spend national energies on Western expansion. The Western lands were just beginning to mature as settled areas. Kentucky, for example, gained statehood in 1792. Washington was committed to domestic growth and was willing to suffer minor foreign setbacks if, by so doing, America's internal growth could continue. Firm neutrality continued to be America's foreign policy. It was an uneasy policy, for Washington was continuously under attack from all political factions. The problem was made more exasperating by reports of French and British seizures and harassments of unarmed American ships. Atrocities at sea inflamed American passions. Soon, government officials were secretly plotting with foreign diplomats to gain support for their plans. Hamilton, for example, in actions that bordered on treason, supplied British agents with many government secrets. Jefferson's support for the French was just as adamant, though not as extreme. He saw the European struggle as an ideological battle, and felt that the United States, the world's first important republic, should support democracy throughout the world. Newspapers became a major instrument of politics, and both Hamilton and Jefferson employed newspapers to attack each other, both politically and personally. Then, to touch off the fiery situation, the Citizen Genet affair occurred in 1793. Citizen Genet, the French representative in America, mistakenly thought that Jefferson's attitudes were shared by most Americans. Accordingly, he was arrogant in his demands for United States support of his country. He even commissioned American ships to serve as French privateers to seize British merchant shipping, a step that would be considered an American act of war by the British. This led to such an outcry that even Jefferson had to denounce Genet. Overnight, the pro-French Jeffersonians suffered a catastrophic loss of public support. Genet, incidentally, learned that a change of government had taken place in France, and, fearful for his life, asked for and received permission to stay in America as a private citizen. Jefferson, though, was discredited by the Genet affair and quit the cabinet by the end of 1793. Although he would remain the leader of the Anti-Federalists, now called the Democrat-Republicans, he would take no part in government till 1796. Hamilton, too, soon overplayed his hand, and support for the British was destroyed less than a year later. Hamilton, knowing that John Jay was going to London to negotiate a treaty to have the British withdraw from the Northwest Territory, leaked details of the mission to the British. He hoped to force America to ally herself with Britain. So when Jay went to London in 1794, he was unable to secure all the terms he hoped for. Although the British agreed to leave the Northwest Territory, they refused to respect the neutrality rights of the American ships on the high seas. The final terms of the Jay Treaty were humiliating to the United States. Although Congress passed the treaty in 1795, no one was satisfied with it, and popular feelings ran against Hamilton and the Federalists who supported it. Hamilton's plan had backfired badly as anti-British resentment built. But neutrality was maintained, regardless of conspiracy and treachery, thanks mainly to Washington's force of will. The Neutrality Act of 1794 made it official government policy, and the hot debate began to die off. Interest turned to local concerns again, especially in western Pennsylvania, where farmers rebelling against the whiskey tax were on the verge of insurrection. Washington called up federal troops and prepared to crush this whiskey rebellion with force. However, the display of federal power and determination was enough, and the insurrection fell apart. The firm use of force stood in marked contrast to the Confederation government's immobility in the face of Shays' rebellion. Although Washington's popularity suffered, the incident enhanced the federal image of strength, resolve, and security, an image which helped spur domestic growth. New cities and homesteads sprang up throughout the West as the government demonstrated its ability to safeguard settlers on the frontier. Washington was also intent on destroying hostile Indian power on the frontier. Peace was secured following the Battle of Fallen Timbers, fought in August of 1794, between American forces under General Anthony Wayne and a coalition of Indian tribes. The quality of American life was now vastly different from 1789. By 1795, Alexander Hamilton resigned from the cabinet as a result of these changes. America now was unreceptive to his rigid ideas and scheming approach to government. He would play an increasingly less important role in national life till his death in an 1803 duel with Aaron Burr. Thomas Pinckney symbolized the growth of a new American spirit in 1795 when he negotiated the Pinckney Treaty with Spain. It gave the U.S. navigation rights on the Mississippi River and rights to use the Spanish-held port of New Orleans for storage and shipping. This treaty made up for the debacle of the Jay Treaty. Thus the government was able to function and flourish without either Hamilton or Jefferson. It had survived its birth, and in 1796, Washington again thought of retirement. The Land Act of 1796 provided additional stimulus for settlement. The Neutrality Act of 1794 guaranteed America's survival. The nation was financially sound. Political disaster had been averted, and the Union was growing. Tennessee had just gained statehood. Washington announced his retirement with very few doubts about national stability. In 1796, he issued his 4-year-old farewell address, and an era in American history drew to a close. By retiring to Mount Vernon voluntarily, Washington also removed the last fear of the framers of the Constitution, the fear that a strong, popular president would make himself king. In 1796, this became a baseless fear. John Adams became the second president. With Adams' election, Washington's career in American public life was over. It had spanned over 20 years of violence and upheaval. Washington enjoyed the peace of Mount Vernon almost unbrokenly from 1796 till his death in 1799. The greatest of the Patriots, he had seen the American nation grow from 13 colonies to a dignified and free union of law and ideals.